Hey, I just found this article that's a systematic review and meta-analysis showing that 70 to 80% of what we do when we're doing manual therapy has nothing to do with the treatment itself. It has more to do with these contextual effects or non-specific effects, things like expectancy bias, therapeutic alliance, placebo, and how well we as physical therapists explain the treatment to the patients. Apparently this research has been around since the 90s. What are you doing? Should I draw the sword or get it in there? I'm practicing my dry needling. Oh, well, according to this 2024 systematic review and meta-analysis, if we focused more on these contextual effects and non-specific effects, we'd get 70 to 80%, and the treatment technique is more like 10 to 15%.
First off, I think Professor Meg Steele probably didn't have ill intentions in making this video, but as somebody who claims to be going through her PhD, she should have caught some of the stuff that I'm talking about. She also does something in this video that I think accounts for a lot of the misinformation in our field, and I'm going to go over this terrible technique that's being used on social media as well, so you guys can be aware of it. Now, first off, she cites this study, which portion of physiotherapy treatment's effect is not attributable to the specific effects in people with musculoskeletal pain, a meta-analysis of randomized placebo-controlled trials. And as she's talking about this study, she's using some language to me that sounds correlational, and then she starts talking in proportions. And I know you guys don't handle research as often as I do and work with research as often as I do and do these systematic reviews, but I knew something was off because correlations and proportions are not the same thing. Well, it ends up they didn't use correlational or proportional math, and this is where the study is badly flawed. They end up passing off ratio of means as proportions. And those are not the same thing. It would be like saying a 2-to-1 ratio is the same thing as 50%. And those things don't match. All you guys really have to know at this point is that's not the same type of data, right? 2-to-1 ratio is not the same thing as 50%. It just doesn't work out. Now, this study is flawed for a lot of reasons, but it starts with this bad math. And somebody already went through the trouble of critiquing this particular systematic review and publishing that critique. And I'll cite that below as well if you guys are interested in getting into the nitty and gritty of the systematic review. Now, the important thing about all this is I would have expected a professor and PhD student to catch that. Not only does the systematic review itself sound fishy, but there is a critique published that she could have looked up. That's a problem. Now, there are more direct methods for determining the effects of contextual influences on physical therapy outcomes. And we have some good randomized control trials on those effects. For example, pain neuroscience education, which would deal with things like fear avoidance behavior and education on pain and expectations. We've done a systematic review on that, and all of the randomized control trials show that pain neuroscience education as an intervention by itself is relatively ineffective. It is one of the least effective interventions in our toolkits, and we'll put the link to that systematic review below. Further, there are several randomized control trials investigating things like nocebo effects, false narratives, expectations, and guess what? They have almost no effect on the outcomes of manual therapy at all. The thing that expectations does affect is the perception of pain during the technique. And then there's this one little thing of if somebody is in a super high stress state, manipulations have slightly less effect, and that probably has to do with guarding during doing the manipulations technique. But you can see in these more direct ways of researching contextual effects, we actually see that contextual effects have very little influence. The funny thing is she goes on to dismiss dry needling in this video, and dry needling is incredibly well supported in the research, like surprisingly so. Even I was surprised by how well supported dry needling is and how effective it is even compared to other interventions. Okay, now let's get into this strategy that this video uses that I think is horrible and is contributing to a ton of misinformation in our field, and this perception that our field is full of things that don't work. The strategy goes something like this. I'm going to call myself an evidence-based professional. I'm going to show you my credentials. And to prove that I'm an evidence-based professional, I'm going to cherry pick a systematic review. Why a systematic review? Because systematic reviews are the best evidence. And then once I find a systematic review, it's not going to be just any systematic review. It's going to be a systematic review on something I hate. And I'm going to find a systematic review that fails to refute the null hypothesis about the thing I hate so that I can dismiss it altogether. And then once I do that, I can promote the thing I like despite the fact that I have no evidence to support it at all. Okay, this whole strategy is completely flawed, right? Number one, systematic reviews are not the best evidence. Systematic reviews are exactly what they sound like. They're reviews of evidence. Saying a systematic review is best evidence is kind of like saying Rotten Tomatoes is better than Netflix. Reviews can be helpful, but they're not the original data, okay? Now, the next thing is cherry picking, right? Whether you cherry pick a systematic review or cherry pick a single study, you're still very vulnerable to bias, right? So if there's multiple systematic reviews out there, you need to read them to at least get an idea of what different reviews, what different conclusions reviews are coming to, and realize that most systematic reviews don't represent the full body of research. So even just from the perspective of a systematic review not representing the full body of research, you still run this big risk of bias. Then we get into the trickier stuff. A failure to refute the null hypothesis in a systematic review doesn't necessarily mean the intervention didn't work, right? There's a lot of reasons why systematic reviews can fail to refute the null hypothesis, and we wrote an article on this. It gets a little technical, but I think you guys will handle it just fine with a little more time to specifically focus on this particular topic. I'll leave the link to the article we wrote in the captions, right? So it's important to know that a failure to refute the null hypothesis in a systematic review does not dismiss the technique. If anything, it gives you a reason to look at the original research and see what the trend is in the original research. This is one of the reasons why we like vote counting synthesis, because I think it leads to a more transparent analysis and a more obvious, right? Again, that word transparent conclusions, right? So like we're going to come to conclusions and you're going to see exactly how we got there. Now, the next part of this is this idea of, since I dismissed your technique, I'm obviously right. And that doesn't work either. That's something called the unsupported default position fallacy. And what that fallacy is basically stating is just because you prove somebody wrong doesn't mean you're right. Really, we should be leaning towards the most well-supported position, whatever that is, whether it's your position, my position, or some other position. There might be an infinite number of positions. So if you prove something about my position wrong, I could still end up being the most well-supported, especially if you have no evidence, which means we should still lean in the direction of my position. Or if your position has the most evidence, then we go in the direction of your position. But whatever position we choose, it should be based on which position is more well-supported, not I proved you wrong, so obviously I'm right. That doesn't make any sense. Now, obviously this video uses this strategy, then tries to dismiss something that is very well supported in dry needling to try to promote a psychosocial course, which I can only imagine includes some of the stuff we talked about before that is not well supported and randomized controlled trials show is relatively ineffective, right? So at the end of the day, research is important. Understanding research is important. I hope I clarified some of the problems with this particular video and something for you guys to latch on to. If you find somebody trying to dismiss interventions with a single systematic review that fails to refute the null hypothesis, run! They have no idea what they're talking about.